Welcome to the McCarthy Report, the podcast where I, Rich Lowry, discuss with Andy McCarthy the latest legal and national security issues. This week, what else? The Mar-a-Lago search. You are, of course, listening to a National Review podcast. If for some reason you're not already following us on a streaming service, you can find us everywhere from Spotify to iTunes. And please give this podcast an Andy McCarthy, the glowing, indeed gushing 5-star reviews they deserve on iTunes. And now, without further ado, I welcome to this very podcast, through the miracle of Zoom, none other than Andy McCarthy.
Rich, how are you?
I'm good, Andy. How are you?
As long as we don't say raid, I think we're fine. We're good.
Well, this is one of those weeks. We know it's been a good week when we've already talked like 5 times on the phone before we get to the Friday podcast conversation. But as we're preparing to record here late, I guess it's early afternoon, I should say, on Friday, stunning news out of upstate New York. Salman Rushdie, who had a fatwa placed on him for his novel 40 years ago, has been stabbed when he was preparing to give a book talk. What do we make of this?
Well, I think, Rich, it probably at least 2 things. One is, we should stress we don't know how bad this is yet. I saw a report right before we started that said he was either punched or stabbed. And there are other reports that say he was stabbed. No one is saying how bad it was yet, because this is something I think it literally just happened, within the last hour or two. And the news is just breaking. He was evidently making a public appearance and giving a talk when it happened. And I guess, the 2 things I would say about it, one is an overarching point, and then one is a here and now point. The overarching point is it continues to be, jihadist terrorism hasn't gone away. It continues to be a major security challenge for the United States. And when you have someone like Ayatollah Khomeini, who is an iconic figure in jihadist circles, to the point that despite the enmity between Sunni and Shiite jihadist circles, Khomeini was a kind of a cross-cutting figure. When I prosecuted the blind sheikh, who was an iconic figure in Sunni Islam and Sunni jihadist circles, he was a great admirer of Khomeini's. They would have had, I always thought the differences between the Shiites and the Sunnis, when it got down to it, I mean, they have theological differences, but a lot of it's more political than theological. But when it came to somebody who was willing to take on America, like all the rhetoric the blind sheikh engaged in about cutting off the head of the snake, which was his favorite way of talking about America, that all came from Khomeini. Mm-hmm. And he really admired the way that Khomeini was willing to take it to the United States in a way that, most of the jihadist activity was more local up until that point. And Khomeini's ascension showed that even in the 1970s, I remember, in the 70s, people looked at this and said, a fundamentalist religious movement taking over a country in 1979. Are you kidding me? Mm-hmm. But it was very real, and I think we underestimated, and we learned to our detriment years later that we underestimated. But when a powerful, iconic figure like this issues a fatwa, it tells all the crazies globally that, your duty is to take this person out. And it has no statute of limitations on it. It's like, 40 years ago. So that's always out there. And then the other thing about the here and now, I don't think you can, we don't have details yet, so I don't want to get hysterical, but I don't think you can dismiss the possibility that there's a connection here between what happened here and what we're learning about what the Iranians have been up to in the last couple of years, including the case that we've learned about in connection with our friend John Bolton, which was a very serious murder conspiracy. So I'm very worried about this, because I think that we kind of, I think, overcorrect. So when the Soviet Union collapsed and then we had this wave of jihadism, we decided that big power politics was over, and now we're in a world of international law enforcement trying to bring jihadism to heel, and great power politics was over. And then all of a sudden, it was like jihadism got shoved into a corner someplace, and great power politics was back, and we could pretend like the jihadist threat was gone. But if we talked, Rich, less than a year ago, maybe a year ago, it all runs together. But when Afghanistan collapsed, this was suddenly something that it was always something we needed to keep our eye on again. But suddenly, once again, we had Al Qaeda and other jihadist groups having what they need to have to be a major international threat, which is partnership with the incumbent government. And the Iranian problem has never gone away, and in many respects has gotten worse. I think as as Biden, for whatever insane reason, decides that he wants to take another shot at bringing Iran to the table to rejoin this very counterproductive nuclear deal that would put them on a glide path to having a weapon. I was almost relieved yesterday to read the Washington Post that the Biden administration is worried about Trump having nuclear information because at least they're worried about somebody getting nuclear information. But it's very, very bad. It's a sober reminder that the world continues to be a dangerous place.
So let's go to the search. First of all, let's start for some of our listeners. We're going to be overtaken by events on this one because we're expecting a ruling by the judge on whether the warrant can be unsealed. What do you expect to happen?
The only mystery to me, Rich, is why President Trump hasn't just put the warrant out, because we know that the Justice Department now is going to ask the judge to unseal it. And former President Trump had made an announcement last night that he not only is not objecting to that, he is encouraging for it to be unsealed. Now, I've thought it was the story, the news coverage today in the Trump-friendly circles, I thought was very amusing because they all ran with this headline that Trump demands release of warrant. And I'm like, Trump has had the friggin' warrant since Monday. He could have put it out anytime he wanted to. But I guess the only question I have is, will Trump try to jump the gun on this judge, Bruce Reinhardt? I should, Rich, by the way, because there's been some confusion about who Reinhardt is, I should probably just take a step back and tell people it was wrongly reported in a couple of places. I think this came from Keith Olbermann first, that Reinhardt was a Trump-appointed judge. And in fact, Reinhardt is not, first of all, he's not an Article 3 district judge at all. He's what's known as a magistrate judge. And they're really high-level appointees of the court, not of presidents. Don't pick them. And they help the district judges mainly what they help them with is like discovery in civil cases and trying to manage their civil dockets, which are immense. But among the lower level tasks that they perform so that district judges don't have to, is that they can sign search warrants. So he's not a Trump appointed judge, even though he became a magistrate while Trump was president. He was picked by the judges in the Southern District of Florida. And he does seem to be, I mean, I think he should have recused himself from this because he already recused himself from something that had to do with a litigation that pitted Trump against Hillary Clinton. And he said he had to get out of that because he couldn't be fair. And yet he decided he was in a good position to sign this warrant, which I think is not a good move on his part. And I have a feeling that President Trump may remind him of that periodically over the. But in any event, he is not a Trump appointee. He did sign the warrant. It's a big deal to the Justice Department that he signed the warrant because, as we saw from Attorney General Garland's very brief remarks yesterday, the Justice Department ain't saying much. So they're relying on the fact that they got a detached magistrate judge to sign off on this. That's their basically their case, that they have probable cause, at least until we see the probable cause warrant, which may be a long time from now before we see that. But my big question is, will President Trump jump the gun on the judge and put the warrant out before the judge does? And the only reason at this point, Rich, since he could have put it out at any time, and I think Garland played that part of things well, by not only getting out in front of Trump in trying to unseal it, which kind of underscores that the Justice Department is happy for people to see the warrant, and it's Trump that doesn't want them to see the warrant. But I think he twisted the knife a little bit by saying, but of course the judge should hear President Trump to see if he has any objections to releasing the warrant, so that his privacy concerns and other concerns are protected. So not only did Garland take the steps that are necessary to release the warrant, he reminded people that Trump hadn't released the warrant, and he put it on Trump again to ask him if are you objecting to people seeing this? So I thought that part of it was well played. The only reason I could think of that Trump hasn't put the warrant out yet is maybe he wants to see the warrant that the Justice Department puts out to compare it to the one he has, to make sure that it's on the up and up. Other than that, I can't think of a single reason why he wouldn't have put it out already.
So the reason that Trump critics posit is the warrant makes it clear this is really highly sensitive national security material, and Trump would prefer that people don't know that, or at least wants to delay them knowing it.
Yeah, I think that's true, but I also think, once it's clear it's going to be released, now it's a matter of posturing, right? You know that it's going to be released. So the question is, who puts it out? Because the game that gets played here is spin. I mean, even the Justice Department is spinning now. They're out there. Right. Not only are they speaking publicly, they're leaking to their friends at the Washington Post.
So let's I want to get into the main substance of it in just a minute. But last thing on this. So what is your view of Garland going out? Because on the one hand, people are very critical, I believe, I remember correctly. You were critical of Comey going out and talking at great length about the Hillary matter and violating protocol. And the word from the Justice Department was, we're never doing that again. We're not talking about this. Sorry, it's as silent as a crypt. That's just the way we operate. And, after 2 or 3 days of heat, lo and behold, here's Merrick Garland talking about it and engaged in a game of spin and interpretation and public posture over a matter that would never be the case in any other instance.
Yeah, well, I think it's very different from Comey, though, Rich, in the sense that he didn't marshal the evidence against Trump the way that Comey did with Hillary Clinton. Comey spent 14 minutes. If you only listen to the first 13 and a half minutes of Comey's summation, as it were, you would have thought that he was about to ask the jury to find Hillary guilty. I mean, he really, I think it showed people what a good prosecutor he was when he was a prosecutor, but he he really marshaled the evidence against her. Garland didn't do anything like that. Garland basically said, he came out and he said, look, we don't talk about this stuff, but as long as President Trump has gone public with the fact that the warrant happened, we think that we should put the warrant out, but we're not putting the affidavit out, which is what lays out the probable cause. We're not going to describe the evidence. And I think that, the upside, Rich, for him in doing this is that it underscored that Trump is the one that doesn't want the warrant out, that Trump could have put the warrant out at any point. And what he was trying to do was have it both ways, right? He was trying to put his story out about what happened, but at the same time, not let people see what the judge said the FBI could search for. So in that sense, I think it's a marginal advance of the ball for Garland. But I think for the very reason that you're stressing, which is that he has deep misgivings about even giving this statement at all, there's a good argument, I think, that it's a net negative for him, in the sense that if you don't speak, I think what people are going to assume is that the Justice Department disagrees with everything that President Trump is saying. And as far as the probable cause is concerned, they can rely on the fact that the judge found probable cause. So the Justice Department doesn't have to defend that at all. So if he's silent, the Justice Department has a good position. They just are, we can assume that they refute everything that Trump is saying. The problem, once you begin to speak, is that you have to address the things that people are actually interested in. And if you fail to do that, when Trump is out there speaking, then it's like you're not refuting what he's saying. So I think, what I think people are interested in here is why the warrant and why now? President Trump is out there saying, we were having negotiations with the Justice Department. It was amicable. Back in June, we sat down. We had a good meeting. They asked me to put a better lock on the premises. I did that. We gave them some stuff. If they had asked us for other stuff and we had it, we would have given them that too. Now, President Trump has a spotted history, and as some have said, only a sort of a remote relationship with the truth. And fine, that may all be so. We can be skeptical about his version of events, but the thing is, he has a version of events that he has addressed publicly. So if Garland's going to choose to speak, he needs to address what Trump has said. Otherwise, he's going to be taken to not have anything to say to refute what Trump has said. So I think the downside for Garland in speaking is that once you start to talk, you have to engage the things that people care about. And I don't think he did.
Mm-hmm.
I really don't think he addressed the questions that we're interested in. And he kind of left Trump's version of events out there unrebutted.
So let's go to the just the basics here and the substance. So there's Trump takes these boxes of material, either carelessly or believing that they belong to him. The National Archives is like, wait a minute, this does not belong to you. A lot of this belongs to the United States government. There's a back and forth about it. 15 boxes go back to the National Archives in a negotiated settlement. And then they're like, wait a minute, we're looking at this stuff. We're seeing classified stuff. We're sure there's other classified stuff. We're worried there's other classified stuff. And the materials are still keeping. Officials show up at Mar-a-Lago in June. They're like, hey, let's put a lock on this. And we're concerned about this. And Trump's lawyers are there. And it's, according to all reports, amicable. Trump's playing the host. Can I get you guys a drink? Whatever you need. Don't worry, fellas. We'll get it for you. And then there's a subpoena also there in June. And according to what Trump people will tell you is that there's no communication after that, except for a request for security video around one of the rooms or the basement, just to make sure people aren't coming in and out, which is apparently complied with. And then boom, the FBI shows up, not Roger Stone style, not banging on the doors, guns drawn, even without wearing their traditional shirts or jackets. But there's, they're there for 8 hours rummaging through stuff, which is an inherently aggressive move. So just what are your big couple takeaways just from the basic facts here, and then we'll pull on various threads.
Well, I'm surprised by some of it. Your narrative is all quite correct. The thing I wonder about is I've been in a lot of meetings where subpoenas were exchanged, and they don't tend to be that amicable. So I'm surprised in the middle of all that amicableness that like a subpoena gets handed over. So I'm a little bit suspicious about some of the details, and I would be.
Sorry, Eddie, was it handed over in that same interaction where the officials came down?
Yeah, Rich, it was,
okay.
I think June 8th was the meeting, if I'm remembering the date right. And I'm going to get back to June because I think the date is important. But this is a scheduled meeting. 3 or 4 FBI agents come down with some Justice Department officials, including high-ranking National Security Division Justice Department officials. So it's clear that whatever negotiations had resulted in this meeting ended up with it was clear that what this was all about was national security information. And we have to assume that whatever negotiations there were began in around January of 2022, when the National Archives, after getting the 16 boxes or 15 boxes that you referred to, they find that there's documentation that's marked classified, and as a result, they refer that to the government. Now, I want to just take a second, Rich, and make a point, because you mentioned the National Records Act or the Presidential Records Act. And there's this interplay here with the Presidential Records Act and classified information. Because this has been conflated in the public discussion, I think we need to tell our listeners that the Presidential Records Act is not a criminal statute. Up until Watergate, it was kind of assumed that presidents were the owners of the records of their administrations, that they were the property of the president, not the government. To the point that this is why you have all these, presidential libraries all over the country for the, various presidents, because these were not deemed to be government records. They were, the president's materials. In the Watergate controversy, there was a big to-do, obviously, over not only the tapes, but other materials. And the question was, did the tapes belong to Nixon? Were they the government's records? Were they, what were they? And Congress at that point jumps into the breach and really changed the underlying legal assumption by essentially saying a lot of this stuff is presumptively government material. It doesn't belong to the president. But the thing is, they were breaking new ground. And it wasn't back in the 1970s, people didn't instinctively say, oh, we have a situation, we need a criminal law here. That was not the way things worked. I think we're much quicker to criminalize things now than we were half a century ago. But they make this statute that basically says, this is government material. It belongs to the government. The National Archives are going to be the custodian of it, but they don't put any criminal law provisions in it. And the reason I think that's important to stress is we're talking here about a search warrant. As a matter of criminal law, you can't get a search warrant unless you have probable cause of a crime and probable cause that evidence of the crime is likely to be found in the place you want to search. So if you don't have a crime, you don't get a search warrant. Mm-hmm. You can't get a search warrant over the Presidential Records Act. Now, you might be able to come up with some, interesting, creative criminal law theory that these are stolen government files. Maybe you can, try to invoke the embezzlement statute, but I don't think the Justice Department wants to do that in connection with the president because, like Barack Obama has like $30 million documents worth of stuff that, as I understand it, hasn't been accounted for. You have the whole Hillary Clinton debacle, and you've had, a number of disputes between former presidents and the government about what's theirs and what belongs to the government. But the reason I want to make this point is classified information has to be the reason why they do the search warrant. Now, it's a doctrine of law, and the reason I say that classified information has to be the reason is because there are criminal laws that deal with the mishandling and worse of classified information. So that has to be what we're talking about if we're talking about a warrant. And there's been a lot of reporting that suggests that, they were very concerned about the Presidential Records Act, so they got a search warrant. You can't get a search warrant for the Presidential Records Act. So now, there's a doctrine of law that says once the agents have lawful authority, once they have a valid warrant issued by a court, if they go into a premises and they see evidence of illegality that's not covered by the warrant, they're not required to turn a blind eye to it. So I bet you the Justice Department takes the position that even beyond classified information, if that's what got them in the door, once they're in the door and they're conducting a lawful search, if they see government records and they know that there's a dispute regarding the Presidential Records Act, their position will be they can take that stuff. Now, I think the Trump people are going to probably come back and say the doctrine of law that says that you can take stuff that's not covered in the warrant means evidence of crimes that are not covered in the warrant, not evidence of civil wrongs. So that'll be an interesting dispute going down the road. But I just want people to understand, if they got a warrant, it's for classified information and mishandling classified information. It's not for all these other government records, even if Trump shouldn't have taken all the government records that he took.
So in other words, if to try to put a pin on it, if he has stuff that National Archives thinks belongs to it, and under the Presidential Records Act, seems like the National Archives has a better case, that's not, FBI can't show up over that. It has to show up over a violation of some law dealing with the handling of classified material.
Yes, it needs a crime. It has to have probable cause of a penal offense, and the Presidential Records Act is not there's no penal offense.
And is the Presidential Records Act constitutional?
I don't know that it's been litigated. I think it would probably be upheld by the Supreme Court. I think that Congress has the power to take the position that at least some presidential records, particularly if they're presidential records that deal with agencies, executive branch agencies that were created by Congress, you could easily see that Congress in its oversight authority could say that those records had to be managed. I don't know, other than in the context of what happened with President Nixon and Watergate, and then a few other issues that have come up in connection with executive privilege. That's been litigated with the assumption that these records are government records. But I don't know that any president has ever made the constitutional argument that the Presidential Records Act is unconstitutional, and that these records they are the property of the president. Mm-hmm. And I think it would be hard for a president to make that argument, because the thing that makes them presidential records is the fact that they are within the official duties of the government, of the president. I mean, they're not things that the president owns when the president enters power. And I think to the extent the president has ownership interest in things or privacy interest in things, that's covered by executive privilege. So the Presidential Records Act doesn't say that wholesale you could get it, anybody, including Congress, can get access to any records in the government. But it's got to be the right government official who asserts executive privilege. There's a whole to-do about whether former presidents have the right to assert it. The Supreme Court suggested in the post-Watergate cases that former presidents do maintain some quantum of executive privilege over records that were generated during their presidency. But we've seen in connection with the January 6th hearings, where the incumbent president doesn't support the former president's assertion of executive privilege, the courts have found there's not much privilege there. I mean, they've ruled against Trump. So it's an interesting question, and it may be one that we end up getting litigated. The reason I wanted to make the distinction, Rich, is since we have to have a crime and the crime has to be classified information, there's a lot of very cavalier talk being winged around about classified information. In this case, unlike the Hillary Clinton case, you are dealing with the only official in the United States government who sua sponte, on his own, unilaterally, can declassify anything the hell he wants to declassify.
So that's what I was going to ask you next. So the Trump people will basically suggest that Trump said, they're leaving. He's leaving the White House. Trump says, there are all these Kim Jong-un letters. I love those. And he did, he showed the Kim Jong letters to everyone. Bring those in the box. They're mine. This note from Macron after we hosted them at Mount Vernon. Macron and his wife love that. Melania loves that. That's mine. Bring that over. This box over here, mine. Okay, this is my stuff. It's declassified now. It's all mine. So they basically suggest he wants it. It's declassified, right? And that's the way it works. He has the ultimate authority on this question. Any procedures that the executive branch usually goes through with people, at the National Security Council stamping stuff and making 40 copies of everything, blown away, irrelevant. In fact, if you want to honor their procedure over what Trump wants to do, you got it totally backwards. It's the president's prerogative. And he waved the wand. We've seen some of this. Kash Patel's basically said this. All the stuff they're concerned about, he declassified in some form or another. What do you make of that whole that argument?
Well, it's one of those things where, when you're getting ready for arguments in the Court of Appeals, if you wanted to make sure someone was prepared, you'd always ask them the worst case scenario question. And the worst case scenario question here, it really is, let's say we have like super secret nuclear information, which is what we're talking about. Are you really seriously saying that if everybody agrees that that's super secret classified information should not be in a place that's, not protected the way government standards are, that a president can just say it's declassified and that's the end of it? And I think the answer is yes, that's exactly what we're saying, or what I'm saying. And the reason for that, Rich, is aside from my instinctive resistance to the progressive theory that the executive branch should be compartmentalized and run by professionals, and that the president is kind of just like a ceremonial leader over all of it, but that the thing runs on its own. And like the Justice Department and the FBI, they're a separate branch of government, and the intelligence community over here, they're a separate branch of government. And the president has to comply with all these bureaucratic strictures that have been, that have grown up over the years. And in fact, the theory of our constitutional government is there's only one person in the executive branch that has any power. As Justice Scalia said in Morrison v. Olson in that famous dissent, when the Constitution says that the executive power is reposed in a president of the United States, that means all of the executive power. There's only one official who has executive power, that's the president. Everybody else is a delegate of the president. Merrick Garland has no power. Merrick Garland gets to exercise the president's power as his delegate. So if that's your constitutional theory, and that is the originalist constitutional theory, then it is simply a fact that the president can declassify anything he wants. Now, when we say those things, I think historically that would not have been a controversial thing to say, because we would have had some fundamental assumptions about what kinds of things presidents would do. So if you had information that would be absolutely, perilously dangerous to the country if it fell in the wrong hands, you wouldn't expect a president to handle it cavalierly. Mm-hmm. And by the way, I don't think this is unique to Trump. I mean, we found that there are a number of government officials that we found, Trump may take this to a new level as he's done with, any number of things, but there's a lot of people, I in the post I did early this morning, Rich, I revisited Comey's, then FBI Director Comey's summary of the evidence against Hillary Clinton. And it was devastating with respect to how he addressed the way she recklessly handled classified information and how utterly irresponsible it was. And guess what we were talking about, Rich? Exactly what the Washington Post was talking about last night. Special access program information, the highest, most sensitive intelligence in the government. So this is not just like a Trump thing. But the fact of the matter is, if the question is, can the president unilaterally declassify? I think the answer is yes. Now, it raises an interesting question of law that we've never had to deal with before, a question of fact, I should say, which is, let's assume for argument's sake that I'm right, and as a matter of law, he can declassify whatever he wants. He still has to have done it. So the question is, right, he can only declassify while he is still president. So if he has items down there that he decided to keep, and he didn't declassify them, then
Right.
they're still classified. On the other hand, there's no set procedure that tells us how a president declassifies information.
Mm-hmm.
If he says, it's declassified, that to my mind would be enough. Is it enough to say if he thinks it's declassified? That, like, does he have to do something expressive? Or I don't know. I don't think we've ever litigated this before.
We haven't. I was listening to watching Lawrence O'Donnell the other night, and just to get an idea, what the other side was saying, and they had a couple very well informed national security professors specializing in national security law, and one of these guys made this point: if you're litigating if you're prosecuting on the basis you're gonna have to litigate this matter that's never been litigated, how the president actually declassifies. So do you have any take? I mean, we don't know, but any take on how likely it is that is stuff that would totally freak us out that Trump was likely to have down there? I'll show my cards. I'm skeptical. I think that the stuff that's most sensitive is locked away somewhere, and you're not sending a White House usher to go get it out of the triple locked safe without someone trying to stop them. And if they can't stop him, immediately telling the Washington Post, So it just seems unlikely to me. Like the Russia thing, like everything else, there's a lot we don't know that I acknowledge, and if I'm wrong, I'll say I'm wrong. I'll follow the facts, but I'm highly skeptical.
Yeah, well, we're edging into my theory, which is that this really isn't about classified information at all. But let me, along the lines of what you're saying, Rich, let me make 2 points. One is, since I mentioned what the Washington Post reported, I should also mention the counter case, which is that President Trump vehemently denies that nuclear weapons intelligence is involved here.
Mm-hmm.
And he said that report, as he put it, I think it was fake news. Oh, it's a hoax, just like the Russia hoax. That's the quote from this morning. So Trump denies it. Now, I have a feeling that it's going to be, it's not going to be this terrible worst case scenario of classified information that you can imagine, but it's probably going to be information that would be embarrassing to Trump that he handled in a way that he would keep it down there in a place where it shouldn't be. I think it's the truth will be someplace in the middle. But the second thing I want to say, which goes exactly, I think, to the point you're making, is let's say we're talking about what the Washington Post is talking about: special access information, which only a handful of people in the government are read into and allowed to get access to. And it's totally need to know. And it's a teeny tiny group of people. Okay. And that's what they expected to find. Rich, there were 30 FBI agents there. Do you think they read 30 FBI agents into a special access program so that they could execute a search warrant thinking that information was really going to be there? I don't think so. Mm-hmm. I mean, I've seen how, classified information gets handled when it's handled correctly, and how persnickety they are about making sure that somebody who doesn't have the clearance and doesn't have the need to know is not in a position where that person is able to see the thing that he doesn't have the right to see, even if he has a security clearance. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure all these FBI agents who got sent there had security clearances of some level. And I'm sure you had some people who were running the thing who had very high security clearances. But if you're going to turn 20 or 30 FBI agents loose and tell them, all right, fellas, go find, what's in the warrant, what you're opening up the possibility of is somebody who doesn't have the appropriate security clearance to see this top secret, super secret, special access information is going to get precisely that. They're going to be exposed to something they're not allowed to see. I don't believe it. So maybe I'll be wrong too, but I don't believe it.
So, Andy, we're 40 minutes into the podcast, and we're finally going to work our way around to your theory. And I've heard many people cite it as your theory. It's not our theory. I'm not totally sold on this one. I get sold every time I talk to you, then I get unsold. when some other people express skepticism. But your belief, the question that has been asked by some people, what changed between early June and now that would have created this great urgency to go after these documents? Have been there for going on almost 2 years, and are locked away and have a camera on some of them apparently, and are not being used as cocktail napkins at big parties at Mar-a-Lago. Why all of a sudden you gotta go grab them? And your theory is, well, yeah, something did change. It didn't have anything to do with the status of those documents or concern necessarily over those documents being down there, ratcheting up to some entirely new level. The environment around January 6th, the demands for action by the left and the media, the January 6th committee hearings, all that created pressure for Garland to get going on some sort of January 6th investigation. So, it lines up. We got, Eastman, a search on Eastman. We have a search on this other guy, Justice Guy Clark. We have Scott Perry, the congressman, right after the Mar-a-Lago raid. FBI comes and says, whoops, by the way, your phone is ours. So that's what's going on here. It's pretextual, as you alluded to earlier. If you find other evidence of another crime, you can take that too. And that's what they're sniffing around looking for.
Yeah, I think I still convinced this is right, Rich, with a couple of caveats. One is to accept my theory that this is pretextual. That doesn't mean that they're not interested in the national security information. Of course, they would like that back. What I'm saying is that they have a closet agenda, making a January 6th case on Trump, which is more important to them than getting the national security information back. Time-wise, this lines up. It also method-wise lines up. And let me explain what I mean by that. You mentioned the Eastman and Jeff Clark subpoenas that were done, not subpoenas, I'm sorry, search warrants that were done at the end of June. And this was right after, the controversy that we are referring to here is there was news that broke in June, not far from the time that Trump would have been meeting with these guys down in with these Justice Department guys on June 8th. But there was news that broke that Garland had reaffirmed guidance that had originally been issued by Trump Attorney General Barr, that if you're going to investigate a presidential candidate, the Attorney General should sign off on that. Now, why that had to be just guidance, Rich, that to me is like putting out a memo that says before you put your shoes on, you should put your socks on. I mean, it just seems like common sense, but fine. And I think the reason that Garland reaffirmed it is it's such common sense. Of course, the Attorney General should sign off on it if you're going to investigate a presidential candidate. But the left got all spun up over it, and there were all these stories about how the fact that he adopted Barr's memo meant that he's not interested in doing the case on Trump, and they're trying to back out of it, and he's too passive, and it's not, the January 6th committee is making this big case on Trump, and the Justice Department is nowhere to be found. So all of a sudden, we see this frenetic activity. Now, in connection with the frenetic activity, this is an important detail. They don't want to say that Trump is the subject of an investigation into January 6th because they're not ready to say that yet. And if they say it in the context of doing search warrants, what that tells the world is they are writing warrants to the United States courts that say they have probable cause of a crime connected to January 6th that they're looping all these guys into.
So why wouldn't they want to say that? Why, if he's under a lot of political pressure to pursue January 6th, why wouldn't that be to his benefit?
Because if they're wrong, if the case is not ready and they're wrong, all the stuff that they put in the warrants are going to bite them later on, and also they may not make the case.
But bite them in what sense?
What do you mean?
How would it bite them? You said it would bite them later on.
Yeah, if you ultimately bring charges against Trump,
mm-hmm.
and the theory of the case that you think you have now, when you don't have a full understanding of the evidence, turns out not to be the theory that you pursue when you bring the case. When you turn over all of this material in discovery, what the defense is going to be able to say to the jury is that the government is just swimming around looking for a theory, that they had a complete, they had one set of ideas that they brought to the court in order to get search warrants. And then by the time they indicted, they had a completely different set that was contradictory. You never want to go to paper until you're sure about what your theory of the prosecution is, because everything you do is going to be turned over in discovery later on. Plus, there'd also be, Rich, there would be a lot of pressure on them if it became clear. Now, I happen to think it is clear, at least to me, that they are trying to build a case of conspiracy to obstruct the congressional count on January 6th of the electoral votes, and as a companion to that, conspiracy to defraud the government. And this is maybe the major one that they're looking at, in the sense of, as the Supreme Court has interpreted that, it's like any deceptive practice that prevents the government from performing its proper functions. So I think their theory is that Trump knew that he had lost the election, but what he did was he put out a story that he had actually won the election. And what they were trying to do was to undermine the popular vote in these contested states. They were trying to put pressure on election officials and especially Republican legislators in those states to substitute the Republican-controlled legislature's vote of a president, presumably for Trump, for the popular vote for Biden. Now, I think there was no chance this was ever going to happen, but I do think that that's what the theory is. And who are the people who are connected to that, to that effort that we know of? Eastman, who is like the architect of the legal strategy to get Pence to get Vice President Pence to discount the electoral votes. Jeff Clark, who was the Justice Department lawyer who was helping Trump try to put pressure. He tried to put the Justice Department's imprimatur on an effort to pressure the states into reconvening and throwing out their popular vote and substituting a legislative determination that Trump had won. And who else? Scott Perry, the congressman from Pennsylvania, who also got as you mentioned, got a search warrant the day after the raid at Mar-a-Lago. He's the congressman who's not only at this big meeting that Trump has on December 21st, 2020 with Freedom Caucus guys from the Hill, where they're telling him, you have to get the Justice Department to do more to help us show fraud. You got to get them behind our fraud allegations. Perry was among the strongest of the people making that argument, and he's the one who introduces Trump to Jeff Clark, and Clark and Trump go from there, and Trump ultimately almost tries to, put Jeff Clark in as Attorney General and fire the front office that he had. And the only reason he didn't was he was persuaded that there'd be mass resignations at the Justice Department. So we know that they're looking at that very hard, Rich, because aside from these search warrants, the other thing they've done in this period of time from June on is they've begun to put people in the grand jury. So they put Mark Short and was it Greg Jacob? Is he the lawyer for Pence? Those guys both went in the grand jury a couple of weeks ago. Last week, they subpoenaed Pat Cipollone and Patrick Philbin, the two top lawyers in Trump's White House counsel's office. All these guys are related to this very thing that they're looking at, which is the pressure, the attempt to use the Justice Department as a hammer to pressure the states to change the electoral votes and to pressure Pence to not count the electoral votes. That's the narrow thing they're looking at. That's the conspiracy case they want to make on Trump. So right in the middle of all this that they do this raid on Mar-a-Lago. And they carry out boxes and boxes and boxes of stuff, we hear, from all these agents that showed up. Does anyone really think that they carried out boxes and boxes and boxes of classified documents? Maybe they did. I don't. I think they were not particularly discriminating with what they took. And they're looking for evidence that can, the big issue that they'll have to prove, if I'm right about the conspiracy they're trying to make, is that Trump knew that the Stop the Steal stuff was nonsense, because that's how they get from his good faith but wrong belief that the election was stolen to his understanding that this was all a fraudulent scam. So that's where they have to get in their case. And I just would ask people, if it makes sense to you, if I'm right and Trump is the target of this, he's the main operator in this conspiracy, do you really think it's possible that they would do a bunch of January 6th related subpoenas and search warrants before Mar-a-Lago and continue to do it after Mar-a-Lago? The Mar-a-Lago search happens in the middle of all this, and the only thing that doesn't have anything to do with January 6th is the search warrant they do on the main guy they're trying to prosecute on January 6th. I can't believe that. I can't believe that's true.
So this is my skepticism about this theory. We've talked about this online. I think Dan McLaughlin, I just had to skim the end of his piece he had yesterday about not believing what the FBI is saying, but not buying this necessarily. Your theory is that Trump's a verbal guy. What's the likelihood of him, especially on something so sensitive, having written anything down and kept it? There was a story earlier this week emanating from Maggie Haberman, the New York Times reporter. Axios reported, though, these images of torn up documents in the toilet. So it just seems that would be a more likely fate for if Trump scribbled any note. I don't believe any of this. But Sydney says we can get them to believe, it was Venezuela that did it. It's going to be ripped up and thrown into a toilet. So what do you make of that pushback, that there wouldn't be anything to find?
Yeah, what I think the world of our colleague Dan McLaughlin, and where I've parted company with Dan is in two ways. One is, I think that Dan is thinking of this in terms of whether he sees a potential crime here. At least that's, some of my discussions with him have been along those lines. And I'm not doing that. What I'm trying to do is put myself in the shoes of the progressive left of center Justice Department that's under a lot of heat from the Democratic base to bring charges here. So I'm not talking about a case that I would bring. I'm talking about a case that they would bring. Mm-hmm. And I'm not talking about a case that Dan would bring, because I think Dan, like me, would not see a crime here. So I'm trying to think of what's the parameters of what they would do, not what I would do, because I don't think there's a crime here unless you can show that Trump was involved in violence. I don't think there's a crime worth bringing. The second thing, Rich, is it's all well and good to say that Trump doesn't use email and he doesn't go to paper and all that stuff. Here's the problem. He was president of the United States. So everybody who deals with him writes notes down. Like, what was the Mueller report made out of? The Mueller report was like 400 pages of notes from the White House counsel's office, because every time they went in to talk to Trump, they wrote like pages and pages of notes. And then they would go back and write, fill in the gaps and make even more notes. What's the best piece of evidence the Justice Department has right now that we know of that Trump knew this whole thing was BS? Trump has a phone call in late December 2020 with Rosen and Doherty, who were then the acting Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General at the Justice Department. And Rosen at a certain point gets exasperated and says to Trump, look, we can't just flip a light switch and create fraud and find fraud and change the result of an election. And Trump gets equally exasperated. And he says to Rosen, I'm not asking you to do that. Just say it was corrupt and leave the rest to me and the Republican congressman. That's the most damaging piece of evidence they have. Now, Trump didn't write that down. He didn't make notes that he said that. He didn't record it. How do we know he said it? He was talking to people and they wrote it down contemporaneously. So the fact that he's not a guy who goes to paper doesn't mean nobody around him was going to paper. And the reason that in this case in California, that they wanted to get all these emails that Eastman has, almost none of those, I think there may be, out of the 111 that they've litigated so far, there's actually thousands that they'll ultimately have to make a decision on, but there were 111 that were involved in the first round. I think there's only one email that Trump have even been copied on. I don't think he participated at all, but it's very damaging. A lot of the emails, when you read the judge's opinion, a lot of the emails are very damaging because Eastman is having contemporaneous conversations with Trump, and then he's telling people to do stuff. So it's obvious where it's coming from. So I just think that, the fact that this guy doesn't go, you take it from somebody who's done investigations, and I hate talking that way because it sounds so arrogant, but you don't win cases. You don't make cases with a smoking gun. There's no Perry Mason. That doesn't happen in real life. Where you make a big case, and the reason a big case is very hard to defend against, is it's like 100 little things that may be seemingly disconnected, but you manage to weave them together. And when you first look at something, it doesn't look like it's a smoking gun, but then when you see how it fits with 5 other things, it's something they can't explain.
So by the way, is go to paper, is that like a investigatory term dealing with mobsters, or what's go to paper?
Go to paper means like, do you memorialize stuff? We had a guy on the stand, the Pizza Connection case, and was it 1985, 86? And I remember I was just a kid. I was like the young guy on the team, and I remember this guy being asked by one of the defense lawyers, what's your proof that so and so in the mafia said that this guy should get hit, or these drugs should be sold. And Buscetta looked at him like very quizzically, and he said, "Nothing is written down in the mafia." So that's where I first started to hear go to paper a lot.
Maybe I'll start when we need stuff from our writers and they're over deadlines. Like, have you gone to paper yet? Have you gone to paper yet? So Andy, we have 2 minutes left before you have to get out of here. So I'll just do the two big questions, and you allocate your time however much you want. The seconds are ticking as I speak here. So do you think Trump will be indicted with anything having to do with anything related to classified documents and mishandling? And do you think he'll be indicted by the feds related to anything related to January 6th?
I think he will not be indicted in connection with classified documents, and he will be indicted on a conspiracy to defraud the United States and obstruct the electoral count. Yes. And by the way, I should say again, I mean, I think I said 6 chances in 10 the first time you asked me this, and I'm up to more than 7. I think I want to make clear, I don't think they should do this. I'm not satisfied there's a crime, and I think the downside for the country of bringing a nonviolent crime case under circumstances where, I mean, you're basically you're going to have to prove 2 things. You're going to have to prove Trump's state of mind, which I think is going to be a hill too high for them to get over. And it would be a matter of criminalizing a frivolous legal theory, which is a very dangerous road for this country to go down. I don't think we want to live in a world where we do that, but I think they're going to do it.
All right. Well, there we have it. That's all the time we have this week. This podcast has been produced by the incomparable Sarah Schutte. Thanks everyone for listening, and thank you, Andy McCarthy.
Thanks, Rich.